Hello, this is Susan Kimmerly, and I am a speech-language pathologist and director of the 9 East Network, which hosts the Vermont Deaf and Hard of Hearing program. I've worked in the field of speech-language pathology and special education and child protection for over 30 years, and I've been in public schools, the state agencies of education and child protection, and for the last 15 years have been the director of 9 East Network.
Hi, this is Jen Bostwick. I am a regional consultant for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing and also the outreach coordinator. I am a teacher of the deaf. I've been working in the field now for 20 years in a variety of settings, including I worked co-taught a kindergarten and first grade classroom with a regular ed teacher. I have taught in a regional classroom for the deaf and hard of hearing, as well as did some coordinating of that program. And I've been a consultant working with kids birth through 22 for about the last 6 years or so, somewhere in that neighborhood.
The purpose of today's webinar is to present you with an overview of family and educational supports for children who are deaf and hard of hearing in Vermont. This is a brief webinar. We have a lot more information than we can present today, so we will be, as I said, giving you an overview. We'll be talking about who we are, what the Vermont Deaf and Hard of Hearing program does. We'll be giving you an introduction to hearing loss, the basic anatomy, types and degrees and eligibility, the effects of hearing loss on child development. We'll talk about the federal Ed.D program, which is the Early Hearing Detection and Intervention national program, as well as what we call PIP, our Parent Information Program, our school age services, and transition services. And we'll end this webinar with a list of resources. So do feel free to ask questions as we go along. I wanted to mention that today is an important day in Vermont's history related to services for deaf and hard of hearing population. Right now, the governor is preparing to sign new legislation known as S66, which creates an advisory council to promote diversity, equality, awareness, and access among individuals who are deaf and hard of hearing. One of the many things that this legislation does is it asks this advisory council to assess services, resources, and opportunities available to children in Vermont, and to make recommendations about communication and language access in all educational settings, and accessibility to qualified teachers, interpreters, and paraprofessionals, as well as educational options and family supports. The impetus of this legislation had to do with the closing of the Vermont Center for Deaf and Hard of Hearing, which occurred about 2 years ago, and that's what ran the Austin School for the Deaf. So about 2 years ago, really 18 months ago, 9 East Network was asked to host the Vermont Deaf and Hard of Hearing program, and so we've been doing that since October 2014. The mission of our program is to empower children through language development and access to communication. We run 2 primary programs at this point in time under these different state and federal grants. The Parent Infant Program is for children who are birth to 3 and their families. And this is done through the Children's Integrated Services, which is also known as CIS. And that program, through that program, we provide information, training, and resources to families. In addition, we have the school-age population for children age 3 through high school, and that is state and locally funded by school districts. Services could be provided under special education entitlement or through 504 or even a school's educational support team. We have, in Vermont right now, we have about 450 children who have hearing loss of some degree. That includes unilateral hearing loss, bilateral, mild, right through profound as far as the different degrees. And we have about 25 babies from birth to 3 up to age 3 at any point in time. and 430 or so school-age children. I don't know how to go back. So we're just going to begin with a brief, what is hearing loss? Hearing loss is also known as hearing impairment, is a partial or total inability to hear. A deaf person has little to no hearing. Hearing loss may occur in one or both ears, and in children, hearing problems can affect the ability to learn.
So I'm going to give a very brief overview about our hearing system and how we hear. Again, this is going to be brief. Sound travels on waves through the air. Our outer ear takes those sound waves and funnels them down into our ear canal, which the sound waves then hit the tympanic membrane or the eardrum, which then vibrates the 3 middle ear bones, which are the smallest bones in our body, which then, as those are vibrating, they will hit the oval window, which connects with the cochlea, which then will cause the hair cells within the cochlea to move, which will then send a signal from the auditory nerve up to the brain. So as you can imagine, if there is any disruption in any part of that system, it will result in some type of hearing loss. Yeah, go ahead. So the first type that we're going to talk about is conductive hearing loss. And on the previous slide, you could see that deals with the outer ear through the middle ear. If any part of that is disrupted and the sound is not moving efficiently through there, then it will cause some hearing loss. The sounds will sound quieter, a little bit more muffled, kind of like when your ear is plugged. Actually, one type of conductive hearing loss is if you just have wax in your ear. If you have an ear infection, that's another cause of conductive hearing loss. Any type of fluid in the ear, whether it's just allergies or anything, it doesn't have to be an infection. An infection in the outer ear can also cause some hearing loss. If you have a hole in your eardrum, any of those are what we call a conductive hearing loss. You can also have problems with those little middle ear bones that we were talking about earlier, that will disrupt some of the sound moving through. The next type of hearing loss that we're going to talk about is sensory neural hearing loss, what we call sensory neural hearing loss, which is any hearing loss that's in the inner ear, or the cochlea. Another word for that area is the cochlea. If the hair cells are damaged or destroyed for any reason, then that will cause hearing loss. That can be caused by ototoxic drugs. Sometimes there is a genetic component to hearing loss. Aging, as we get older, those hair cells just degrade over time. Head trauma can be another reason for damage to that inner ear. If the inner ear is malformed at birth, that can cause hearing loss. Also, just repeated exposure to loud noise is another actually very prominent cause right now, given people wearing earbuds and stuff in their ear. That's a big concern. And sensory neural hearing loss is typically permanent. Occasionally, sometimes conductive hearing loss, I didn't talk about this before, can be medically treated and repaired. Whereas typically sensory neural hearing loss is not. It's a permanent hearing loss. And there will be more distortion with sensory neural hearing loss than with conductive hearing loss. Often somebody with a sensory neural hearing loss will require some type of a hearing device, hearing aid, or something. The next type of hearing loss is a mixed hearing loss, which is if the person has any mix of conductive and sensory neural. So maybe the person has an ear infection on top of having sensory neural hearing loss. If they have any combination of the two, then we call it a mixed hearing loss. So the next slide that I'm going to talk a little bit about is explain this picture here, which is called an audiogram. And this is what we use a lot to sort of begin, this is kind of what we look at the very beginning when we're looking at a new child that we're working with. And this doesn't have any hearing loss plotted on it, but if somebody was tested, what the audiologist would be doing would be going through and plotting where they're first able to hear the sounds. And if you look across the top of the audiogram, you'll see frequency in cycles per second moving from 125 over to 8,000. That is the pitch of the sound. So starting at the left, moving to the right, very low pitched sounds, moving to very high pitched sounds. And then if you start at the top and move towards the bottom, those are very, very quiet sounds, moving to extremely loud sounds. And so how we would get this information is that, depending on the age of the child, sometimes it's an ABR or an auditory brainstem response where the audiologist will be able to get some information and plot it in here. Sometimes as the child gets older, they will be tested in the booth using a variety of methods where we can like I said, plot where they're first able to detect sounds. On this audiogram, there's some simple pictures. For example, you can see that a piano is about 80 decibels loud, and it's about, it's a mid-frequency sound. Water dripping is a very quiet sound, and it's also a very low sound. It's a little bit hard to see, I think, but some of the speech sounds are also plotted on there. Like, for example, the S sound is a very, very high frequency sound, and it's also very quiet. So that's a sound that often somebody with hearing loss may struggle to hear. Those word endings, possessives, plurals, things like that.
So the hearing loss has many possible effects on child development. We're going to talk briefly about some of the ones here, and then later we'll be discussing what our services do for that. So the primary effect is on a child's communication and expressive and receptive language, really meaning the vocabulary, the rules for the structure of language, which helps people express their thoughts. So that the expressive language includes those things, and also the understanding of language. So having that system for communication is a critical aspect of child development, and is probably the most urgent area that we are addressing in the early years. In addition, articulation is affected, and in many different ways, in particular those high frequency sounds that Jen had just presented to you. Social skills is another area because of the difficulties with communication and language that can affect the social skills of children. And there was a particular article that I think we were going to talk about for a second.
Hi. Yeah, I was just going to talk. Recently, there was I think it was actually released in 2012, a study by Christine Yoshinaga Itano, which is quite a last name, and amongst other researchers, looking at the pragmatic and social language of kids with hearing loss. And it was found that using the pragmatic skills checklist, which is a checklist of 45 skills, they found that kids with any degree of hearing loss, it would be expected that kids with more severe hearing loss would be more delayed in those skills, but really they found, and they were more delayed, but really across the board, kids with any level of hearing loss are found to struggle much more with some of those social language skills, like work problem solving with a friend, explaining the rules of playing a game. Those type of things are all found to be more challenging than we thought they were in the past. So that's something that we have definitely been trying to focus a little bit more on with kids across the board.
And then behavioral aspects include the masking of certain areas. So some children look like they have attention deficit disorder, but it could be related to their hearing loss and not have to do with any medical changes in their attention. Mild and fluctuating hearing loss can look virtually identical to attention deficit disorder, characterized by being inattentive, talking out of turn, difficulty following directions, and sustaining attention for long periods of time. Because if you can't hear everything, you might not be willing to try to sustain attention for long periods. So this composition of these possible effects can certainly affect low self-esteem, because children typically are very aware of where they are in their social environment, and if they are aware that they are not acting like typical peers, missing out on things, then that can affect their self-esteem. And as Jen mentioned, it's not always dependent on the severity of the hearing loss. Mild hearing loss can still have a significant impact on some students. So for our services, we have criteria that we have to follow based on our funding sources. And in general, we follow the rules for for IDEA, both parts C and B, which I often refer to as special education, but it does play out a little bit differently. In general, hearing loss means deafness or hard of hearing as determined by an audiologist or other related medical professionals, and it's demonstrated by a 25 decibel hearing loss in the hearing threshold, or worse for one or more of the frequencies. So as Jen presented earlier, there could be just one frequency between 250 and 8,000 hertz, and that makes them eligible whether they have a hearing aid or not have a hearing aid. There are other aspects of eligibility that play out, especially in the school-age population, which I'll talk about a little more when we get to school-age in particular. But we're going to start with the young children. And as we get into talking about young children, I want to start with talking about the Early Hearing Detection and Intervention Program. And that is a federal initiative that has been around for several years, and people in our Ed.D office in Vermont would know exactly when that started. But the purpose of Ed.D is to ensure that all newborns have the opportunity to communicate from birth. And the CDC's Ed.D program is a part of continuing national efforts to promote the early detection of hearing loss, the tracking of infants and children who are deaf or hard of hearing, and the initiation of effective intervention services. All children in Vermont are screened, and we're trying to screen everyone by 1 month of age. And that includes children born in hospitals or at homes. And Vermont does a really good job in our early hearing screening, as well as diagnosis is by 2 months of age, 3 months of age, where once a child is screened, they get rescreened or get diagnosed by an audiologist to determine that there is a hearing loss and it wasn't just a false positive at the screening end, or that something has changed. And so by 3 months, we're trying to diagnose all children with hearing loss, so that by 6 months of age, they are participating in effective intervention systems. So and then get hearing aids if they need them. That would be included in the intervention program, both the amplification as well as the access to services like our PIP program. So.
Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit, sort of an overview about our, like she had said, Susan said, the PIP program, or the Parent-Infant Program. Our focus for this program is absolutely family-centered care. This care can take place in the home or the daycare typically. It's our responsibility to give unbiased and evidence-based information and resources. The focus is on the family's priorities and concerns. You know, we certainly share information, and then from that they talk about what are their what do they want to focus on and first. Some of the things that we typically focus on with families are general hearing loss information, hearing equipment. All of us are pretty skilled at understanding how to use equipment. So if problems or questions arise, we're typically pretty good at helping solve those, or can certainly help them get them solved. We try to support around audiology appointments, especially in the very beginning. Families are going to these appointments. They're getting a lot of new information thrown at them, a lot of new vocabulary and language that they probably haven't ever heard before, as well as just sometimes the shock and grief of hearing that their child has a hearing loss. We try to support them around that. Communication opportunities. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the different communication options or opportunities out there. We often collaborate with other service providers. The OT, PT, SLP are some that we collaborate with a lot, as well as obviously the CIS service coordinator. We work with the family through their routines in their home to promote strong language development. So we look at what the family is doing and use that to try to, how can we incorporate some language strategies within those routines that they're already doing. You know, new parents certainly have plenty to deal with, and we try to incorporate our ideas within what they're already doing. They don't need more work. We also assist in looking at the child's language development just to make sure that it's on track or moving the right direction. We do this, we have some tools that we use. The language development scale by Sky High is one that we use fairly often, as well as sometimes we work in collaboration with speech language pathologists. And then we're also involved in the transition from the parent-infant program to the school age program when the child turns 3 years old. So the first communication option that I'm going to talk about, and again, I'm talking about these quite briefly. If there are further questions, you can certainly call Vermont Family Network or 9 East Network. The first communication option is American Sign Language, or ASL. It's a full, complex, visual spatial language that's used by the deaf community in the United States and some parts of Canada. Like I said before, it is a full language. It is not English sort of transcribed onto your hands. It is a full language. It's a native language of many deaf and deaf or hard of hearing men, women, and children, as well as children who have deaf parents. That is often their native language that they're using in their home. The second option that is out there is the listening and spoken language. It's sometimes called the LISLS approach. This is really focused on relying on children using their residual hearing that they can to the best of their ability. So these are often children that are using cochlear implants, although not often. And typically there's no sign, well, not typically, always there's no sign involved in this approach for the most part. It's really focusing on those kids using their auditory channel only. The next method is called cued speech. Cued speech is used it's not used very much in Vermont. There are places around the country where it's used more. There are not many children in Vermont that are using cued speech, but it is certainly an option. It's a visual system of communication. It's a phonemic-based system which makes spoken English or any spoken language visually accessible. It uses hand shapes, which are called cues, that the hand shapes actually represent the consonants, and the placement of the hand shape around your mouth or throat or neck area represents the vowels. It's a way to it's a supplement to speech reading, because speech reading you're not able to get all of the information through speech reading alone. So this allows you to have a visual cue. You know, was that C or B that they said? When you add the visual cue, then it allows you to see that. The next method that we're going to look at is called, it actually has a number of things that it's called. Sign-supported speech is what it's often called here. Conceptually accurate signed English, or CASE, or simultaneous communication are really the three most common things that this is called. And this basically it refers to using simultaneous sign and spoken language. It's driven by the English word order, which ASL is not. ASL has its own, like I said, grammar, syntax, so it has a completely different word order or sign order, whereas this type actually follows English word order. Typically, the key words are emphasized, and most often we don't include function words or word endings, which would sometimes, if you're using something called signed exact English, which we actually did not put a slide in here for that. Signed exact English is just that, where you're signing every single word and word ending in English word order.
So as Jen had mentioned, the PIP program is really family-centered and helps the families navigate through all the dynamics that come with identifying with their child being identified with a hearing loss. And she just reviewed more specifically some of the communication aspects to the opportunities and decisions that parents are making. At the age of 3, child services shift from being through the Children's Integrated Services program to the school districts, also known as local education agencies, or LEAs. And so at the school age population, then we shift into a different way for accessing services. So the school age program, for us, our focus is to foster access to education for children. And referrals come to this program often just from PIP. The child will just move into being having access to our program. But if it's a new child being identified or moving into a new school district, we often get referrals from audiologists or from the school districts themselves, but it must always be accompanied by audiological information. So we don't just follow up from a screening. We need to have an audiological diagnosis of the hearing loss. within the school age program, then the child's either getting services through a typical special education avenue, which has the 3 gates of eligibility, the first of which is the criteria that I mentioned earlier about 25 decibel loss, minimum of 25 decibel loss in 1 or more frequencies in 1 or both ears. And then there are additional decisions that get addressed to see if the child is eligible for special education. For 504, which is really entitling the child to accommodations and modifications, the child needs to simply meet that decibel loss that we have talked about. Once we are involved in a child's program, there's many things that we do, and we summarize our service delivery as through either consultation or direct service. Our consultation includes things like an initial observation to see a child in a classroom or in their daycare setting. We conduct in-service training for school districts that talks about, helps the child's team understand the effects of the child's hearing loss and what they can do about it. In addition, we assist with the child's personal and classroom listening devices during the school day, the monitoring of the child's listening skills, and helping the teams assist develop the IEPs and goals and objectives for either the 504 plan or the IEP. And the main shift here from PIP to the school age program is that we receive a state grant from the state agency of education, and we also receive funds from the local school districts. And so the school district, we are assisting the schools to help the child, whereas in the PIP program, we are working directly with the families to help their child and to work with them to work with their child. So there's a slight shift there. So our consultants become typically members of the educational team, of which a parent is also a member. But many of the decisions are by consensus, but sometimes it's the school district's decision that prevails when we're talking about the goals and objectives and the service delivery for these children. Our consultants we have 11 of them at this point in time, and they are typically licensed teachers of the deaf, audiologists, speech-language pathologists, and some of our staff are a combination of those. And they're assigned by regions. So we have one consultant might have 10 supervisory unions, and they see all the children in that particular supervisory union. We do a lot of teaming. If necessary, at least not on-site, but off-site, we do a lot of networking with one another and cross-training because so many of our consultants have some specialized skills in some area or another. So we do make sure that we're getting the most current information so that we can provide that to the school teams and to the families. We also provide direct service, which would typically be under an IEP, so through special education. And that would include things like sign instruction for families or school teams by qualified individuals. So we are, it's actually an area that we're working on now, is to be more clear about what our specifications are to be a qualified individual. And these sign instruction for families or school teams would be for children who have been identified as deaf and where the family has chosen to have ASL or sign instruction be part of their child's communication. We also work on oral rehabilitation for cochlear implant users to really assist the child in their ability to listen as they're using this device. Another area is self-advocacy, and even from a young age, we try to make sure that the children understand what their needs are in a classroom so that they know if they really are better sitting in the front, that they do it on their own, that they know if their hearing aid that needs to be checked or that somebody forgot to check it that day, or if they've identified that the battery might not be working, that we're really working on children's self-advocacy skills all along. One of the ways in which we help educational teams is by recommending accommodations or modifications to the child's educational program. And in general, here's a list of some of the accommodations, and then we will go into some of those in more detail. So instructional accommodation, so how the teacher is teaching, is an area that we would like that we address with teachers in their classroom, and that might include the language that they're using, how complex it is, what keywords might need to be emphasized at different points in time during instruction, what kinds of questions are being asked to maximize the child's ability to participate in the classroom despite the hearing loss. Curricular modifications, so what is being taught, that's another area that we would make recommendations and where we might suggest some accommodations on how to still have the same level of curriculum, but maybe not have all the details that are covered in certain aspects of a curriculum. Physical environment accommodations having to do with where the child sits, what the acoustics are in the classroom are some examples of those. I think I mentioned communication accommodations. And through classroom observations, we will evaluate or assess how accommodations or modifications are being implemented in the classroom.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about different accommodations around amplification that are often used in schools and at home. Some personal hearing instruments, hearing aids, cochlear implants, BAHA or other tactile devices. In addition, often in schools, students are using a personal FM, personal FM or DM device that can either be connected directly to their FM, or they can also be used if they are not currently using a hearing aid or such. Fairly recently, there has been a change in a pretty important one that we use. It was always called FM, which means frequency modulation. There's a new technology called DM or digital modulation, which is currently being used very successfully in schools. It's sort of an upgrade, if you will, from FM. It has been shown to have much less kind of white background noise, which has been a complaint that students have given us for years, that there's just a little bit of white noise in FM. DM is a much clearer signal. As well, there are no channels involved. When a student has an FM in the school, they have a specific channel that is theirs and theirs alone. And if there are other kids in the school using an FM there, and if their channels are too close, there can be some overlap or interference between the two. With DM, this does not or cannot occur. The signal is constantly, it will just sort of hop from frequency to frequency as needed to make sure that there's no interference and the signal is very clear, which is really great. So like I said before, those DM or FM can be used connected directly to a hearing aid or cochlear implant or BAHA, or they can also be used if a child does not have an FM. If a child does not have any type of hearing assistive technology. Another type of system is a sound-filled system, which is for all intents and purposes, a speaker that is in the classroom that sends the teacher signal, or whoever is wearing the microphone sends their signal out to a wide distribution area versus the personal FMs go directly to the ear. The next couple pages, I actually have some pictures of different types of equipment. As you can see, there are lots of different types of hearing aids now, from teeny tiny invisible in the canal to, the traditional hearing aid, behind the ear hearing aid that we sort of think of. Down, you can also see the white picture that's, I can't point, but it's a white device, is a cochlear implant. The one on the second row down in the middle is a BAHA, which is a bone anchored hearing aid. And that is a type of hearing aid that's used for people that have conductive hearing loss, or it can also be used for somebody that has single-sided deafness. So if one of their ears is completely deaf, you can use that and it will send the signal through bone conduction to the other cochlea, which is functioning normally, hopefully. I also have an FM transmitter here, or DM transmitter. They really look identical. And that's the piece that the teacher wears clipped to their shirt. So yeah, you can see there's a wide range of equipment that we deal with on a regular basis. I didn't go into a lot of detail about how each of these work. If you have questions, you can certainly let us know. The next page, I have a couple different types of the sound field systems, just that are made by, basically they're just made by different companies. You can see this tall, skinny tower, and then the other tower that's right next to that, which is a little bit wider. And then the other system looks like a little box that has a little microphone that somebody wears. That is what we call a toteable system, or a desktop system. That can be used for somebody with fluctuating hearing loss, or maybe somebody who can't tolerate wearing personal FM on their ears for whatever reason. So those are just, like I said, a few different types of amplification accommodations that we often put in place in schools. The next accommodations focus around communication in the classroom. A big one that we talk about is just making sure that the seating arrangement in the classroom is appropriate, so that the student can see both the teacher and the peers whenever necessary, because kids get a lot of information by seeing their peers' faces. You know, they get some information from lip reading. Obtaining the student's attention before beginning to speak to them, just saying their name. You can't always assume that they're really, quote, listening to you, and you're not going to know that you really have their full attention until you get their eye contact. But making sure that background noise is kept to a minimum is a really important one. Background noise is probably the most challenging thing that kids face in, not just in the classroom, in general. When there's background noise present, it makes listening extremely challenging. Speech reading conditions, making sure you're not talking with your head turned away from them, not chewing gum, things like that. Presenting information in a simple, structured manner, clearly enunciating your speech. Extra time for processing the information, and then just checking in, frequent checks, more than just, do you understand? Do you know what you're doing? But tell me what the first thing you need to do is. Tell me what you need to do after you finish this, so you really know that they're understanding the directions. As well, some kids require more in-depth, like an ASL interpreter or a cued speech transliterator or a communication facilitator, which is somebody who can kind of go between some sign and English depending on the child's needs. Next, we're going to talk about some instructional accommodations and modifications. Visual supports are very important in the classroom, really for all children, and typically they are used a great deal in classrooms now, but that's something that we just remind teachers of. Interactive whiteboards like smartboards, Mimeos. Captioning is another thing that can be used, where the CART or CPrint and Typewell are the three most common types of captioning, and that is where somebody is sitting in the classroom and is listening to the teacher give his or her lecture or discussion and typing on a computer, where the student can refer back to the computer screen. They're typically sitting near the computer screen where the person is typing into, and they can then refer back to that as needed for questions or if they're missing information. Obviously, that requires somebody who has strong English and reading skills. Things like captioning on videos. If a child is unable to take notes while they're listening to a lecture or discussion, having somebody take notes for them. Listening in the classroom is extremely exhausting, so sometimes they may need a little bit of downtime listening break. Making sure that instructions are really clear step by step. As I said before, interpreting whatever type of interpreting that student requires. Tutoring is sometimes necessary. And as well, there are some kids that Susan was talking about before that really require some direct instruction rather than just being able to access their education fully through listening in the full classroom. Some of them need some more direct, whether that's one-to-one or small group instruction. Physical environment, something that we think just look around, carpeting, acoustic tiles, if a child doesn't have the capability to hear a fire alarm, making sure that they have flashing fire alarms or smoke detectors in the classroom. What we call chair slippers are something that we recommend a lot. Little things that sit on the hook onto the bottom of chairs. Looks like we have a question here. Are these accommodations given in more often in special education, in special schools as opposed to mainstream public schools, or are they offered in both? And the question, typically we are only working in public schools because we are funded through the agency of Ed. If a child is in a private school, we can provide services if the parents are typically paying for those services out of pocket, or sometimes you can get a minimum amount of funding depending on where the private school is located. For example, if the private school is located in Williston, sometimes the Williston schools have it's typically quite small amount of money that they have allocated to provide some consultation or assistance to kids that are in private schools that are within their area. Just one second.
And the accommodations that Jen mentioned are really entitlements, so they are available in mainstream public school settings as well as in specialized schools, but it's according to the process that's individualized for each child. So the team would have to agree that certain accommodations are necessary for that child.
Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit about curricular modifications. Those can entail having reading assignments or written assignments, either shortened in length, or maybe for reading assignments, maybe you add in some type of a visual phonics based, some assistance there. Extra time or extra practice. Pre-teaching and post-teaching vocabulary and concepts is a big one. Children with hearing loss typically have lower vocabulary skills than kids with normal hearing. So that's something that we really try to make sure that those skills those supports are put in place as much as we can. I'm just seeing if all of these. Sometimes there are alternative curriculum that we recommend. Especially if a child is using American Sign Language, which really has some specific areas that we need to focus on. Sometimes we will recommend some specific curricula to schools. In terms of evaluations and tests that students and children are required to take, sometimes we do recommend alternative types of testing, although I would say that's not super common, but it does happen at sometimes. Extra time. Sometimes children need to take the test in an alternative setting to make sure, like we talked about, that the background noise is the best that it can be and the listening environment is the best that it can be. We're running a little bit short on time. So in terms of, okay. So some other things that we look at for, these are more, specific and child dependent on the kids. All of them are child dependent, but the expanded core curriculum is something that is a set of skills that are specific to deaf and hard of hearing kids that we sometimes put additional goals, recommend additional goals in the IEP around, and the expanded core curriculum focuses on audiology, career education, communication, family education, functional skills, determination and advocacy, social emotional skills, and technology. So we want to make, like Susan talked a little bit about before, we want to make sure that these kids have a strong understanding when they're leaving school about their hearing loss, what it is, how do they access the audiologist, how do they know where they should sit in a class, how do they can they ask their boss at work for a special phone? We want kids when they leave school to know what they are able to ask for. So that's another thing that we sometimes take into consideration when we're making recommendations for accommodations. Counseling is something that we also recommend at times. Family supports and training. Susan talked a little bit about occasionally families who have chosen to use sign with their children will receive some additional sign instruction either at home or in the school, and that's actually the next bullet down too. Interaction and meeting deaf and hard of hearing peers is something that we try to put in place. This is Vermont, and we have limited resources and people, but it is very empowering for these kids to meet and see other children who are deaf or hard of hearing and like themselves and have the same, challenges, face the same challenges as in school.
Now, we had a question about, is there paperwork to fill out in order to apply for, I think the writer means the accommodations. And once a child is school age, there are the different processes that I mentioned related to 504 or special education. And I think the Vermont Family Network is really the best place to turn to get some guidance on that. So there is more processes to follow rather than paperwork to fill out. So if you go back to the VFN website, I think you'll get more information, and you could certainly contact them and get a parent coach or advocate or a consultant that could help you. In addition, the consultant from the Deaf and Hard of Hearing program could help you navigate that system as well. Now, our final topic is on transition. And this transition, when we say transition, there are many transitions we all have in life, but are typically referring to from childhood to adulthood or getting ready for life after high school, so called secondary transition. There are three main areas that I'm going to talk about, and one is the primary agency that gets involved, that our program tries to connect eligible individuals to, is vocational rehabilitation, or VR, or Voc Rehab, goes by all of those names. And Voc Rehab has general Voc Rehab counselors, or they have rehabilitation counselors for the deaf if it's appropriate. They have a higher a criteria of 50 or 55 decibel loss in the young adult's hearing to be eligible. So it is a much more exclusive population that receives that particular type of counselor, but voc rehab general counselors would also have access to some information. There's been a change in the federal law over the last 18 months that expands services available to school-age children. And so the same money that voc rehab has always gotten now has to go to children. I think it's as young, it might be as young as 14, but 16 is more typically the age. And so we are working with voc rehab to understand fully now what those services might entail for children that are still in school. One of the themes, I guess, of this talk is on advocacy, because that's another topic for transition, where we want to make sure that young adults understand their rights as a person with a hearing loss. We want to make sure that they understand their hearing loss and the accommodations that they may need, and that they understand what resources are available to them, whether they're at college, and get financial resources, or the state system in their community. What kind of access what do they need to help them access the public services in our environment? So it's a big area throughout our program, vocational rehabilitation program, and also the following resources: Petnet, which is a federally funded project whose mission is to increase the education, career, and lifetime choices available to individuals who are deaf or hard of hearing. So for parents or for young adults, their website is a wealth of information. It includes you can do live chats to get assistance in different topics that you might want help with. They have online training, a lot of modules available, materials that are downloadable, printable, or available as hard copies, and things like that. And it's an area, the area of transition is an area that our program also wants to build our capacity in. As there are becoming more resources available, we're trying to get a better idea of what that is, and to work with special education teams at the high school level, counselors, to make sure that there's capacity within the public schools to help children getting ready for graduation that might have special accommodation needs. So that wraps up our webinar content area. We do have some resources we're going to review with you, and then if there are additional questions, we're happy to entertain them.
So this is a very short list of resources. There are many, many, many more resources on the www.9east.net. There's a wealth of information there as well. We just sort of picked a few. Hands and Voices is a organization that is family and parent run, that their focus is just if your child has hearing loss. It's not communication mode driven or anything like that. It's just if your child has hearing loss, then we welcome you to this group. There's actually the Hands and Voices Vermont chapter is just getting up and running again. I know that Therese Urban is the woman's name who is just getting it up and going again, and her information is on the 9 East website. I apologize, I don't have that handy. You also might be able to go to the Hands and Voices website, and they may have her. I don't know if they have each chapter listed by state, I'm not sure, but they also have a lot of really great just general information about hearing loss, which it's a really great website. You know, on Gallaudet's website, Gallaudet is a college that is specifically geared to deaf and hard of hearing individuals. They also have a wealth of information on their website. There's this is a new resource that's on there that looks at early intervention and building language capacity, language competence for kids who are deaf and hard of hearing. I would definitely recommend looking at that. Babyhearing.org, also just has a lot of general information. Successforkidswithhearingloss.com is a website put out by a woman named Karen Anderson, who is an absolute phenomenal resource for working with deaf and hard of hearing kids who are in the classroom. Her focus is, I would say, mostly on kids who are in the school age, from 3 through 22. But she also has a ton of really great resources on there. In terms of transition, something that we use quite a bit when working with kids it's on the Phonak website there at the top. It's called the Guide to Access Planning. And that has a lot of kind of self-assessments that kids can do, that young adults can do as they get ready to graduate, and kind of assess, where do I need to work? What are some things that I need to work on, or where am I really strong? The NIDCD has some great information about, again, just sort of general hearing loss. The Voc Rehab Vermont website is a great place for if you're looking. You can connect with them, and they can explain to you if your child would be eligible to work with an RCD or the rehab counselor for the deaf, or if they're more appropriate to be working with a general VR counselor. And then again, I talked a little bit about the Gallaudet website, but this Claire web document has a ton of really nice information about transitioning from school out into the workplace. It's a very family-friendly document. So that is our. Oh, I'm sorry. That's the end of our content. But are there any questions? Okay, so it looks like there's not any questions. So thank you for joining us for today's webinar. Please visit Vermont Family Network's website at vermontfamilynetwork.org for helpful resources, upcoming webinars, and other workshops and events. This webinar will be archived along with all of our other webinars and can be viewed on Vermont Family Network's YouTube channel. If you would like to talk with someone at VFN, please call 1-800-800-4005. Have a good day.